Have you ever been struck by a question so simple that it seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime? One of those questions that pierces your soul and throws open doors you've spent years trying to keep locked? Dad, have you ever killed anyone? That's what my son asked me. Out of the blue, innocent eyes, calm voice, and then a silence that echoed louder than any bomb I heard in the war. At that moment, my breath caught. I froze. It wasn't just a question. It was a mirror. It was the pain, the guilt, the fear, the exhaustion, everything I'd hidden behind smiles and automatic responses, everything I'd sworn I'd buried in the desert of memory suddenly emerged as if it had never left. Maybe you haven't gone to war, but have you ever carried some pain that no one sees? Have you ever pretended that everything is fine just so you don't scare the one you love? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now might surprise you. The war doesn't end when the shooting stops. She remains silent. It continues when you return home and realize you no longer know where you belong. It continues on nights when everything is calm, but your mind screams. It continues when you try to be a father, a husband, a friend, and feel that inside you are still on the battlefield. For years I wore this armor, not of iron but of silence. I became the master of short answers. It's all right. It was difficult, but it passed. Let it go. But what no one knew was that the war was not in the past. She was inside me, in the nightmares, in the lost glances, in the distance I put between myself and those who loved me most. Maybe you felt something like this, like you're living with invisible wounds and no one notices. But that day, with my son standing in front of me, waiting for an honest answer, I couldn't lie. My throat closed up, and for the first time, I cried. I cried not only because of the question. I cried for everything I never said, for the lives that have gone, for the weight I carried in silence, for the times I smiled so as not to worry anyone, for the nights I wished I was someone different, someone whole. This story is not just about me. It's about all those who came back different. It's about those who went to war, and also about those who live a battle every day and no longer know how to ask for help. If you know someone like this, or if this story has somehow touched you, take a deep breath, because what comes next isn't easy to hear, but it might open your eyes to something many people hide. And it was in that moment, standing before my son with tears in my eyes, that I understood. The war may even be over out there, but in here, she was just getting started. I stood there staring at that small being who only wanted to understand the world, and who, without knowing it, had just touched the most hidden part of my soul. My son had no idea what that question held, but I knew, and in that moment, I realized that hiding my pain was no longer an act of protection. It was a barrier between us. Have you ever felt this way? As if your silence, which should be a shield, was becoming a wall? If this topic makes sense to you, if at some point you have swallowed tears to appear strong, leave a comment below with what touched you most so far. Sometimes a single word from you can be what someone else needs to read to not feel alone. This space here is not just mine. It is ours. Every like you give helps this video reach further. Maybe even touch someone who also carries invisible scars and hasn't yet found the courage to talk about it. And if you feel that this type of story speaks to something inside you, subscribe to the channel, not just to accompany me, but to walk alongside a community that understands, welcomes, and shares stories that transform. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who need to hear these words. Together we create something bigger than a video. We build a shelter, a place of listening and truth. And in that moment, faced with that question, as the tears flowed without me being able to stop them, I understood that maybe it was time to tell everything, not to relive the pain, but to free what was still trapped. When war ends on the battlefield, it doesn't end within those who survived it. This is something no one tells you. You return home, walk through that door hoping to breathe a sigh of relief, but encounter a different kind of pressure, that of having to be the same as before. People greet you with smiles, tight hugs, welcome dinners, and a silent expectation that everything will now return to normal. But it doesn't. You notice it in the details, in the way your hand still shakes when a loud noise happens out of nowhere, in the sleep that won't come, or that, when it does, drags you back to places you'd rather forget, in the look on your wife's face, trying to understand why you're there in body, but seem so distant inside, in the children running around the house, hoping they don't bump into some memory that still hurts. It's as if the world has pressed the move on button, but you've been trapped in a frame of the past, and no one sees, no one notices. Because the scars you carry aren't on your skin. They're in your soul. They're wounds that don't bleed but that burn every time someone says, "I'm glad you came back in one piece." Whole. On the outside, maybe. Inside, there are missing parts. Some left in the field, others slowly ripped away by guilt, by helplessness, by what you saw, did, or had to accept. And it's not easy to talk about, because you yourself don't fully understand. How can you explain that the smell of a backyard barbecue can take you back to a dusty road where everything smelled like death? How can you say that a simple, "How are you?" can unsettle you? Because the honest answer would be too scary. That's where silence is born. Not the silence of peace, but that of self-protection. You learn to smile with tired eyes, to give automatic responses, to make jokes, to change the subject. Also, no one realizes that, inside, you're fighting another war. One that has no uniform, no trenches, but that wears you down a little more every day. And that's the big dilemma. People want the hero back, but they don't know how to deal with the man who's returned in his place. A man scarred by memories that don't fit into everyday conversations, who's relearning to live in a world where no one understands the weight he carries, who needs to feign normalcy to avoid worrying, to avoid disappointing, to avoid sinking. You start to wonder, what if I tell you how I really feel? What if I show you how I feel inside? But then he thinks, what if they don't understand? What if they judge me? What if I lose what little I still have? So you swallow it all and move on. Functional, but not complete. Present, but incomplete. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this silence has consequences. It shapes who you are, affecting your mindset, your decisions, your relationships. You begin to live behind the scenes of your own life, always afraid that someone will discover the hidden truth you're trying to hide, that you're still trying to get back, that the war isn't over for you yet. And the cruelest part is that little by little, you become convinced that this is your new normal, that living with pain is the price of survival, that there's no cure, only control. But does it have to be this way? Comment here. That makes sense to me, if this reality has ever come close to yours, because maybe it's time to name this pain. You may be back home, with a roof over your head, the familiar smell of morning coffee, the sounds of civilian life swirling around you. But inside, you still live as if on high alert, as if everything could change in a second, as if you're still in enemy territory. Only this time, the enemy is invisible and lives inside your head. It's as if the war had left a programming implanted in it, and your brain no longer knows how to turn it off. Any loud sound makes your heart race. A door slamming can trigger an alarm like an explosion. The smell of smoke on the street becomes a trigger. Sometimes nothing external is needed. The memory comes on its own, suddenly, as if it had a life of its own. And then night comes, and with it, what should be rest turns into battle. You lie down and your body even cries out for sleep, but your mind refuses, because it remembers. It remembers scenes, voices, difficult decisions you had to make. Sometimes you dream, or rather relive, it all over again. The same scene, the same feeling of helplessness, the same urgency, and you wake up with your body sweating, your heart racing, and that question in your throat, why me? You sit on the edge of the bed, run your hand over your face, and take a deep breath. You look to the side and see your wife sleeping peacefully. She doesn't know what just happened, and you choose silence again. You get up, walk through the dark house, and try to return to the present, but you don't always succeed. The next day, everything continues. Coffee on the table, kids off to school, work obligations, and you carry on. You work, you act, you respond, you smile, but only you know how many internal wars you're trying to contain while the world waits for your best version. These flashbacks are treacherous. They don't ask for permission. They appear in the middle of a conversation, during a movie, or even on a simple trip to the supermarket. And no one understands why sometimes you suddenly become so quiet, or seem distant even when you're there. The world around you keeps spinning, but inside you are pieces still stuck to a time that never passed. And the hardest part is that these fragments of the past don't follow any logic. You might be having a good day with everything seemingly calm, and suddenly, something small breaks you inside. A song, an image, a phrase. Everything becomes a direct access to a memory you tried to bury. But there it is, alive, raw, making you relive something that shouldn't reach you anymore. The truth is, there's a layer of suffering that's invisible to the naked eye. A kind of pain that's not easily explained because it's subjective, invisible, and often even you feel guilty for feeling it. After all, it's over, isn't it? You survived, haven't you? But surviving isn't the same as being well, and those who haven't experienced it may never understand. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because these episodes, these flashbacks, these sleepless nights, this constant feeling of alertness, begin to shape your mindset in subtle and dangerous ways. You begin to distrust everything, to doubt peace, to believe that living in tension is safer than letting your guard down. And this has a direct impact on your decisions, the way you relate to others, the way you view life. You start to isolate parts of yourself to avoid triggers. You stay away from certain places, avoid certain types of conversation, create routines that keep you in control. But deep down, you know you're just trying not to explode inside. And sometimes you explode anyway with an anxiety attack, a disproportionate irritation, a cry you can't understand where it came from. This affects your relationships. People start to distance themselves because they can no longer read you. They tell you that you've changed, that you're cold, that you've closed yourself off, and you hear all of this and even understand it, but you don't know how to change, because you don't even recognize yourself completely anymore. And the worst part is when you try to explain, and you get that look of pity or judgment, or even worse, from someone who doesn't believe you, as if you're exaggerating, as if it's all in your head, and it is, but not in the way they think. You start to wish you couldn't remember, couldn't feel, couldn't be this man anymore, carrying the past as if it were glued to his skin. But the more you fight those memories, the more they become a part of you. Because what no one taught you is that trying to forget the pain isn't the same as healing. Forgetting is sweeping it under the rug. Healing is facing it, and facing it requires courage. But not the courage you had in war. It's a different kind of courage. The courage to allow yourself to be fragile, to admit that something inside you has broken, to accept that asking for help isn't weakness, and that it's okay not to be okay. Comment here. I'm on this journey too if you've ever felt something similar, or if you know someone who really needs to be heard. There comes a time when you realize you've become an expert at disguise. You learn to smile with tired eyes, to play with your child as if nothing were out of place, to joke at family dinner while inside you're trying not to fall apart. The mask of strength becomes part of your routine. It's not optional. It's what keeps you functioning. It's the invisible shield you wear so no one discovers the chaos you're trying to hide. And at first it works. You even convince yourself that everything is under control. You speak firmly, solve problems at work, fix the faucet with trembling hands, and do homework with your son as if it were the best moment of the day. But inside you, there's a part that screams, that begs for rest, for truth, for freedom. But showing it seems too risky. You feel like you're never allowed to falter. After all, you came back from war. You survived, so you're expected to be grateful, to be the example of resilience, the man of steel, the one who overcame the impossible. But no one talks about what comes after victory. No one asks the price you paid to stay standing. This pressure, even if veiled, weighs heavily, and it comes from all sides, from society, family, friends, and most of all, from yourself. Because you've learned your whole life that men don't cry, that soldiers can handle it, that feeling is weakness. So you swallow what you feel, keep it to yourself, put a smile on your face, and go. But there comes a time when the body begins to take its toll, the mind begins to fail, and the soul begins to silently cry out for help. The mask that once protected you becomes a prison, and the longer you keep it on, the more distant you feel from the people you love, because they relate to the role you play, not the man you are. You look into your wife's eyes and see the unspoken concern, the fear of touching on topics that might hurt you, and it eats away at you inside. Because you wanted to be transparent, you wanted to be able to say what you feel, but it seems you no longer know how. Or worse, it seems like if you take off the mask, you'll lose everything. So you try to compensate. You buy gifts. You make surprises. You feign lightheartedness. You strive to be the present father, the husband who handles everything, the friend who listens. But every gesture is laced with internal tension, because you're always controlling what you feel, always avoiding going too deep, always running away from the risk of being real. And the cruelest thing is that this mask works so well that the world applauds you for it. They tell you that you're strong, that you're a role model, and this only increases the pressure. Because now, on top of everything else, you have to uphold the image they created of you. the image you yourself nurtured. The truth is, behind many seemingly unshakable men lie stories that have never been told, wounds that never healed, decisions that left their mark, moments that still echo in the mind when no one is around. And this is a part of the journey that few have the courage to embrace. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this emotional armor, this mask you've built, was often your only way to carry on. It protected you in the beginning. It helped you get through difficult days. But at some point, it started to stop you from truly living. And the most challenging part of this transformation is that it doesn't start with big decisions. It starts with small truths, with the recognition that you're tired, that you're hurt, that you need to breathe without pretense. True strength, the kind that transforms, begins when you understand that you no longer need to prove anything to anyone, that being vulnerable doesn't diminish your story. On the contrary, it gives it new meaning. It's behind the scenes of pain that true courage is born, and often, the first step is to stop acting. You don't have to carry it all alone. You don't have to pretend everything's okay when it's not. You don't have to maintain this image of invincibility if deep down, what you most desire is to be accepted as you are, with flaws, with pain, with memories, with everything that makes you human. Write it down. I'm tired of pretending, if this resonated with you, or if you've ever felt like the mask is weighing more than you can bear. No amount of training can prepare anyone for a question like that. It came like an arrow piercing the chest, silent, direct, without warning. Dad, have you ever killed anyone? My son had no idea what those words held. To him, it was innocent curiosity, a simple question, born of the trust a child has in someone they love. But to me, it was like opening a door I'd locked with all my strength. I was sitting in the living room with him on my lap, laughing at something silly he'd said. It was one of those rare moments when life seemed light, almost normal. He looked at me with that expression that blends tenderness and seriousness as only a child can have, and asked the question. No drama, no fear, just wanting to understand the world. At that moment, time stopped. My throat closed. My body froze. I couldn't respond immediately. I tried to keep my gaze steady. I tried to smile. I tried to hide it, but it didn't work. Inside, something snapped. The wall that had held me back for years simply cracked. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't an explosion. It was a tear, a single tear that flowed without me being able to hold it back. And when it fell, it brought with it an entire universe of pain, guilt, memories, and accumulated silence. I didn't cry in the war. I didn't cry when I buried friends, when I returned to camp with blood on my boots, when I closed a comrade's eyes for the last time. But I cried that afternoon, in front of my son, because I realized I could no longer sustain the armor I'd worn for so long. That question broke something that had been bottled up for years, not because of its content itself, but because it came from the person who most represents the future in my life, and because deep down, I didn't want him to grow up with the same pain I carry. His question wasn't judgmental, it wasn't accusatory, it was simply a desire for understanding. But deep inside me, it triggered the memory of every choice I've had to make. Of every night I wondered if I was still worthy of looking in the mirror. Because the battlefield doesn't end when you take off your uniform. It lives on in your consciousness. And the mind is a place where there are no hiding places. I tried to respond. I tried 1,000 ways. But all I could say was, yes. And it wasn't easy. My voice faltered. My son hugged me. He didn't understand everything, of course. But he understood enough to hold me tight, as if saying without words, "It's okay, Dad." And in that hug, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Permission to be human again. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the impact of that question wasn't just the trigger for tears. It was the turning point. It was as if, in that instant, the hidden truth I'd been avoiding facing finally found its way out. That moment forced me to look honestly at everything I'd been repressing. And more than that, it made me realize that keeping this pain hidden wasn't protecting anyone. It was only destroying me from within, little by little. This is one of the biggest traps many of us fall into after experiencing trauma. The idea that silence is noble, that holding in pain is a way to prevent others from suffering. But this comes at a price, because when pain isn't expressed, it transforms. It becomes distance, coldness, untimely emotional outbursts, and that constant feeling of being disconnected from one's own life. With my son, I realized that the truth, Even a harsh one can bring us closer. It can teach us. It can create a kind of bond that isn't built with pretty speeches but with raw honesty. He didn't need to know every detail, but he needed to see that his father was human, that even the strongest have cracks. That courage isn't the absence of pain. It's the willingness to face it. And in this process, I began to understand that the time had come to transform my story, not to erase it, but to give it new meaning. The pain I tried to hide didn't have to be an eternal burden. It could be a bridge, a path to teach, to heal, to connect. From that day on, I decided that my truth would no longer be a burden. It would be a seed of transformation. But this only began because someone asked me a simple question, with pure eyes, and I chose not to lie. Write it down. This really touched me. If at some point in your life a question has ever dismantled you inside, that tear, the first in so many years, didn't fall alone. It dragged up memories, fears, and everything I'd never had the courage to confess even to myself. It was a heavy tear, not because of its volume, but because of what it meant. It was as if, finally, my body had found an outlet for everything that had been bottled up during years of external and internal war. It wasn't just pain. It was liberation. It was the end of absolute control, of that emotional rigidity I'd cultivated, as if it were my shield. And in a way, it was also a silent cry for help. As it streamed down my face, it said what my mouth never could. I'm not okay. And that simple confession, even if silent, changed something in me. It was like crossing a border, a passage between the hardened man I'd become and the possibility of rediscovering parts of myself I thought I'd lost forever. The tear didn't solve everything, didn't heal everything, but it opened space. It shattered the illusion that I could go on with my life if I continued to ignore what had torn me apart. It's strange to say this, but there was beauty in that moment, because for the first time I felt real, without filters, without defenses, without that rigidity that so often made me seem cold even to those I love most. It was as if I had taken off, even for a few seconds, the invisible uniform I'd continued to wear even after the war ended. And suddenly, I was no longer a soldier. I was just a man, a father, a human being, and that, in that moment, was what most freed me. What many people don't understand is that holding back tears, holding back emotions, maintaining an image of unshakable strength, exacts a heavy price. Every time you suppress a tear, you harden a little more inside. You create layers of protection that over time become a prison. You stop feeling because you feel too much and no longer know how to deal with it. And then you begin to live for survival, not fulfillment. But when that tear fell, for the first time I felt like I no longer had to hold it all together, that there was room to be imperfect, to be fragile, to let out what was consuming me so much. And curiously, in that exact moment of greatest vulnerability, I felt stronger than ever. Strong because I was honest. Strong because I didn't run away. Strong because instead of tightening the knot in my throat, I let it melt away. My son looked at me, not with fear, not with judgment, but with a kind of love we only realize when everything falls apart. He didn't understand the details, of course, but he felt it. He felt something there was real. And that connection, that shared silence, said more than any explanation I could offer. In that moment, he didn't see a hero. He saw his father. And I understood that perhaps that's exactly what he always needed to see. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what happened in that moment wasn't just a cry. It was a turning point in my mindset. It was the beginning of a transformation I didn't even know I needed. What had previously been a hidden burden began to become part of my healing journey. For the first time, I saw the hidden truth behind the pain. It wanted to be seen, not conquered. It wanted to be understood, not buried. The tear was just the beginning, a sign that I was ready to stop running from myself. And from then on, something also changed in the way I related to the world. I began to notice the underlying behavior I used to call normal. The way I distanced myself from people, the way I avoided certain topics, the way I exploded over small things. All of this, deep down, was pain trying to find an outlet. And for a long time, I only offered resistance, until it found an opening. And that opening was tears. From then on, I began to rethink my decisions. I began to revisit the choices I made to avoid feeling, to avoid remembering, to avoid facing, and I understood that each of them distanced me from myself. It wasn't just the war that hurt me. It was the way I tried to deal with what the war left behind. And this is something many people experience. Pain doesn't come only from trauma, but from the way we try to silence it. The impact of that single tear was so great because it carried years of silence. It opened a path, an uncomfortable path, yes, but necessary, because relief isn't in erasing the past. It's in giving it new meaning. And this journey begins when we stop pretending everything is okay and start embracing what truly exists within us. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you've ever felt that a single emotion was enough to break down a wall that you've been holding onto for too long. After that tear came silence. A different kind of silence. Not the harsh silence that hides emotions, but a silence filled with meaning. It was as if my son and I were connected by an invisible thread. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. What was said in that moment didn't depend on words. It was in that space of vulnerability that the conversation truly began. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, I didn't try to turn reality into something heroic. I didn't use fancy words. I didn't invent simplified versions of the war so as not to scare him. I also didn't portray myself as a victim. I spoke as a man, as a father, as someone who, despite having returned physically, still carried battlefields within. I spoke of difficult choices. I spoke of fear, loss, confusion. I spoke of the pain of having to keep going when everything inside me screamed to stop. My son, at his young age, didn't understand all the details, and he didn't need to. What he understood was that his father trusted him enough to be honest, and that, in that moment, created a bridge between us that hadn't existed before. He looked at me with a kind of quiet respect, a look of someone who realizes the world is more complex than it seemed, but that, even so, it's still possible to trust someone. And it's strange how, sometimes one conversation changes everything. Something that lasted just a few minutes had a greater impact than years of trying to be the right man. Because being the right man, for me, has always been synonymous with being firm, stable, unshakable. But that afternoon, I understood that being the right man might mean just the opposite. Being transparent, being whole, being truthful. This conversation with my son showed me that future generations don't need to repeat the same cycle of silence and self-effacement, that it's possible to create a new kind of legacy, not based on external achievements or accomplishments, but on the ability to open up, to teach with vulnerability, to form connections through truth, not performance. From that moment on, I began to see myself differently. I began to understand that the war I had lived through didn't have to remain the center of my identity. It was a chapter, yes, a defining chapter, but it no longer had to be the only one. That conversation opened a new door, a door I could enter not as a soldier, but as a father, as a man in process, as someone willing to rebuild not only my external life, but my internal world as well. It was at that moment that I realized that the stories we carry, even the heaviest ones, can become bridges when we have the courage to tell them truthfully, and that we don't need to glorify what hurt, nor romanticize what broke us. Pain, when embraced, teaches. When denied, it isolates us. And I had already spent too much time isolated. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because real transformation begins when you stop running from your story. When you understand that the impact of what you've experienced doesn't have to be an anchor, but can become a driving force. It was this shift in mindset that began to happen within me. I stopped trying to erase the traces of war and began to face them with eyes of learning. I stopped seeing my traumas as shame and began to recognize them as parts of my journey that, although difficult, shaped me. And this change wasn't quick. It wasn't light, but it was honest. And little by little, this new attitude began to affect all my relationships. I became more present, more of a listener, more willing to create real connections, without masks, without armor, without ready-made answers. I realized that the more I accepted my scars, the more they lost their power to control me. The conversation with my son was the beginning, but in truth, it was also an invitation, a call to reclaim parts of myself that had been dormant. And this was so transformative because I was no longer just surviving. I was beginning to live again. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. If you've ever felt that a sincere conversation can change not only a relationship, but everything inside you. After that conversation, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a leap, nor an instantaneous turnaround, more like a slight incline, a subtle detour that gradually led me down a new path, the path of healing. A strange path at first, full of uncertainty, fear, and distrust. Because when you spend too much time repressing everything you feel, the idea of talking about it feels more threatening than silence itself. But I could no longer bear that weight alone. And admitting this was the first step, the hardest of all, because asking for help requires courage, a different kind of courage than I knew. Not the kind you show up on the battlefield, in the face of danger, but the courage to look in the mirror and say, I need someone, the courage to allow yourself to be cared for, to recognize that there are things you can't solve with willpower alone. I sought professional help. I contacted a therapist recommended by a friend, someone who had also experienced their own struggles. In the first session, I confess I remained silent for almost half the time. The feeling of sitting in a room and talking about myself, about the things I had always kept bottled up, was almost unbearable. But it was there, in that safe environment, that I began to understand that my pain wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of humanity. Over time, therapy helped me reorganize memories, to name emotions that previously seemed like chaos. It wasn't easy. Reliving certain episodes was like navigating an emotional minefield. But each time I put a pain into words, it stopped being an untouchable monster and became just a part of my story. Not my whole story, just a part. I also found strength in support groups. There, among strangers who became fellow travelers, I heard stories that made me feel less alone. Men who also carried silences, who also wore masks for years, who also cried in secret. And it was by hearing their truths that I gained the courage to reveal my own. In these meetings, I learned to listen without judgment and to speak without fear. There was a silent understanding, an exchange that went beyond words. Pain, when shared, loses its power to isolate us. And in this process of rebuilding, I also rediscovered my faith. Not the blind faith that demands immediate answers, but a faith that embraces mystery, that welcomes doubt, that allows for fragility. Praying again, even without knowing exactly what to say, was like rediscovering a forgotten place within myself. A place where I could rest without having to understand everything, where I could simply be and be accepted. Little by little, I realized that healing isn't a destination. It's a choice we renew every day. It's a commitment to our own soul, a silent pact to never give up on ourselves. And it was at that point that I began to experience small, everyday miracles. Nightmare-free nights of sleep, guilt-free, lighthearted laughter, genuine laughter that wasn't a disguise, hugs that didn't hide the pain. The most impressive thing is that, by allowing myself to be cared for, I began to care better for others as well. My relationship with my son transformed. He began to see me not as a superhero, but as a real man, present, vulnerable, and strong in the right measure. With my wife, the dialogue gained depth. We began to share not only tasks but also emotions, fears, and hopes. We went from walking side by side as two survivors to walking together as partners in a new phase. Sure, there are still hard days. There are still memories that hurt, triggers that come out of nowhere, moments when the past tries to pull me back. But now I know what to do. I know I can breathe. I can talk. I can ask for help. I know that pain doesn't have to be a dark room where I lock myself away, but can be a passage, a bridge, to something lighter, more whole, more truthful. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this healing journey taught me that there's no single formula. Each person finds their own paths, their own practices, their own rituals of reconstruction, but what all stories of overcoming have in common is the decision to stop hiding, the choice to take a step, even without knowing what comes next. That's what changed everything for me, the willingness to open my soul, to bare myself emotionally, to allow other voices to enter my life with empathy and listening. And perhaps that's what many people are missing. No more brute force, but space to breathe, a place to be heard, an environment where pain doesn't need to be disguised, where we don't need to perform healing before we're truly ready. Because sometimes true transformation happens in the interval between a cry for help and the courage to accept that it's okay to not be okay yet. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you've ever felt that the greatest act of courage is simply admitting that you need support. Today, looking back, I can see more clearly the man who returned from war. And no, he wasn't the same man he was. In fact, perhaps that was the mistake from the start, expecting to return the same. As if it were possible to cross a destruction field, lose parts of yourself and then wear the same clothes, sit on the same couch, laugh at the same jokes as if nothing had happened. The soldier who returned home was a different man, but he wasn't less. He was different, and for the first time, whole. Because the truth is, when you survive war, you bear scars. Some visible, some not. And for a long time, I thought these scars invalidated me, that I needed to hide them, keep quiet, pretend I was still the same person I was before. But over time I understood that the scars weren't open wounds. They were records. Scars that told the story of someone who fell, yes, but who chose to get up. And that choice changes everything. The pain, however intense, didn't define who I am. What defined me were the decisions that came after it. It was every choice to get out of bed on dark days. Every attempt to reconnect with my family, even when the emotional distance felt like an abyss. It was every, "I'm sorry," I had to say to those I loved. Every conversation I began with a shaky voice. Every hug I gave even though I wasn't sure it was deserved. All of this was part of a rebuilding process. Not perfect, but authentic. The war changed me, but it didn't destroy me. And this was a process of acceptance that took time, because there was a part of me that insisted on comparing who I was with who I had been. A voice that said, "You don't smile like you used to. You don't trust like you used to. You don't love like you used to." Until the day I understood that I no longer needed to love, trust, or smile as before. I needed to do this in my new way, with the baggage I carried, with the layers I acquired, with the depth that only those who have faced darkness know. Life, in fact, took on a new texture. Simple things took on a value I'd never realized before. A leisurely family lunch, the sound of my son's laughter echoing through the house, a sunset seen from the porch. All of this took on a brightness only visible after you've been surrounded by shadows. And it's curious how, even after so much suffering, the soul still finds a way to blossom. Not with the same lightness as before, perhaps, but with a different strength. A strength born from the awareness that being here, now, is a privilege. Sure, there are days when memories come flooding back, when pain knocks on the door without warning. But on those days, instead of retreating, I breathe. I remember everything I've overcome. And I hold on to the truth that Asagu chose continue, and that each step on this journey has been a silent affirmation that life is worth living, even when it still hurts. This transformation wasn't magical. It was slow. It was built behind the scenes of a patchwork routine, between falls and new beginnings. And above all, it was done with help, because no one comes back whole alone. The presence of my family, the friends who stayed even when I left, the professionals who patiently extended a hand, all of this was part of my reconstruction. And that's why today I say firmly, yes, I came back different, but I came back whole, in my own time, in my own way. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this journey has shown me a powerful revelation. The true meaning of being strong is not the absence of pain, but the ability to integrate it into your story without letting it determine your future. Strength is not rigidity, it is flexibility. It is allowing yourself to transform. It is knowing that, even when scarred, you still have choices. You can still write new chapters. You can still love, grow, inspire. And this understanding also changed the way I look at others. My empathy grew. My listening skills increased. I began to notice the silent battles in the tired expressions, the lost looks, the prolonged silences of those who don't know where to begin. And, when I can, I reach out. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that no one heals alone. And sometimes all someone needs is a simple gesture that says, "I see you." Comment here. I'm on this journey too, if you've ever felt that pain didn't destroy who you are but helped you see a new path. If you've also returned from a war, and here I'm not just talking about the ones fought with weapons, but the internal ones, the silent ones, the ones no one sees. I want to tell you something you've probably never truly heard. You are not alone. And more than that, you are not broken. What you feel, what you hold, what you carry, it all has meaning. It's all real. There's no such thing as a small pain when it's felt deep within the soul. There's no such thing as a light memory when it still weighs heavy on the chest. Many people fight invisible battles every day. Some return from an emotional war waged at home, or a war with their own bodies, or a war that began with an unexpected loss. Some are tired of keeping up appearances, of feigning strength, of smiling while falling apart inside. And it's to you who may be in that place right now that I want to speak with all the truth I have within me. Silence no longer needs to be your shelter. It may have been useful for a time. It may have protected you when no one would listen, when everything hurt too much. But it no longer needs to be your home. There is another path, a path where you recognize your scars not as signs of weakness, but as marks of someone who faced what many couldn't bear, and survived. Survived even without knowing how, even without answers, even in pieces. Your scars tell a story of courage, a story that deserves to be told, not with shame, but with dignity, because you are no less for feeling, for remembering, for sometimes holding your breath when faced with a trigger. You are more for continuing, for trying, for rebuilding yourself. You are more for not giving up, for searching for meaning even after everything, for wanting to love again, live again, believe again. This journey is yours, but you don't have to walk it alone. There is room for pain, yes, but there is also room for listening, for lightness, for new beginnings. And perhaps the greatest gift you can give yourself right now is to stop demanding a perfect version of yourself. Maybe it's simply allowing yourself to be human, with all that means. And that includes crying, that includes talking, that includes withdrawing when necessary, and coming back when you're ready. I also needed to acknowledge my own shadows. I needed to break the illusion that I needed to be strong all the time. I needed to unlearn a lot of things to relearn how to live more truthfully. And it wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. It wasn't pretty all the time. But it was real. And because it was real, it was liberating. Because freedom isn't about not feeling. It's about feeling with awareness, with compassion, with maturity. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you or someone you love also carries invisible scars, comment here. Let's create a safe space for listening, empathy, and healing together. Comment here. That makes sense to me if you know what it's like to carry something inside that the world doesn't see, but that you feel every day. If you've made it this far, truly, thank you. I know it's not easy to hear certain topics, much less to identify with them, but if this conversation found a place within you, it's because something needed to be touched upon, and that's why this channel exists. So we can build together a place where pain can be expressed, the truth can be heard, and each person's journey is respected for what it is. So, if this kind of content resonates with you, helps you see more clearly, or simply makes you feel less alone, subscribe to the channel. We still have a lot to talk about, and you'll find there's strength even in the pauses. Leave the phrase here in the comments, "I'm with you until the end," just so I know you stuck with me on this journey until the very last second. And if this video touched you in any way, leave a like. Not only to support the content, but because it shows that we're creating a real connection here. There's a video right here that complements all of this and can help you even further on this journey. Click and stay with me there. The conversation isn't over.